Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined today by my longtime friend and colleague, Caldwell, senior editor at the Weekly Standard, author of the best book, I think, on I don't know, post what? Post-Cold War Europe. What do we call the current moment?
Yeah, sure.
The current Europe, which was
post-Cold War, yeah.
Yeah, and the reflections on the revolution in Europe, which it's hard to believe is almost 10 years old.
Well,
updated, however, luckily, by a conversation we had a year ago, and now we're updating it again here in April of 2018, and no one better to get a sense for someone like me who doesn't really follow things in Europe as closely as I should. What is going on in Europe? And you've written, where should we begin? Italy, maybe? You've written well on the recent Italian elections.
Right.
Was that just a joke or a weird thing that happened, or what's the significance? Well, explain a little bit what happened and then explain the significance.
Right. Well, you have I mean, everyone was expecting a sort of an overturning of the system which is now becoming familiar in Europe, but you had a kind of an overturning in two ways. So, or possibly three ways. You know, you had the ouster de facto of the Social Democrats, the Democratic Party, as it's called in Italy. That was the party of Renzi, the former mayor of Florence. You had the rise of a conservative or right-wing party or a nationalist party that's been there for a long time. The League, as it is now called. This is a party that sort of started in the 1980s as the Northern League. It was a secessionist party.
Right.
It was a party that sort of thought that Italy could be run efficiently in the north, but that the south was a burden, and that the cities of Milan and Turin, which is the real, let's say, the commercial heart of Italy, ought to secede from Italy. It was kind of a tax revolt party. They've become progressively more anti-immigrant and, let's say, a classic European populist right-wing party, and they became, to most people's surprise, the largest party on the right. I think most people had expected Silvio Berlusconi to continue his dominance, not of Italy, but of the rightward-leaning part of Italy, and he didn't. And he's been ousted. He's been ousted from that leadership position, even though his formation is still there. And the other surprise is that, well, maybe not so much a surprise. The other great transformative thing was that the Five-Star Movement, which is a party that's that has been hard for some people to take seriously, became the largest party. Okay, and the Five-Star Movement is it was called a populist party until the Northern League came along, and people are needing now to sort of like define these parties a little bit more carefully. The Five-Star Movement is an anti-establishment party, but it does not have a very clear definition in terms of a right or left-wing ideology. It's basically a party of people who believe that the Italian political system is kind of a joke and a scam, run for the benefit of a group of insiders of the main parties of the center left and center right. And so some of the people who feel this way are they're very anti-immigrant, and they think that Italy is getting overrun by immigrants because the parties are corrupt. But it's also got people who are, would consider themselves on the left, and they have a sort of a humanitarian or human rights-oriented idea of making things better for everyone. A kind of a So they're hard to pin down, and I think what happens, whether Italy is able to form a government, is going to hinge a lot on which one of its many inclinations the Five-Star Movement decides to follow.
But I mean, overall, it's a pretty astounding result in the sense that you have a major European country, I think half the vote, more than half the actual vote, going to what anyone would call very anti-establishment,
right,
new parties, in a system which, whatever its problems, and there were jokes always about the Italian political system, had been governed really by the center left and center right for decades, really, right? And Berlusconi, I suppose, was an entering wedge, a precursor maybe of this kind of upheaval.
Berlusconi, I mean, now that we have Trump in this country,
Yeah.
we can see that Berlusconi was actually the beginning of a real marriage between show business and politics, or between media and politics, or say it as you like. But I mean, in a way that, say, Reagan or George Murphy or other people who
Right.
were in the serious business of entertainment, you know, they moved to a different business. It was not the same thing.
No,
okay?
it was Reagan became governor of California for 2 terms and all that, and took
that's
conservative ideas seriously. Whereas Berlusconi
That's right.
was halfway towards Trump, you might say.
That's right.
With
So we
kind of
mustn't-
the,
I mean-
colorful celebrity,
That's right.
shamelessness about his personal life, kind of thing. Yeah.
So we mustn't underestimate Berlusconi. He is
That's interesting. And when
he's
was he? So he was.
So he arrived in the prime ministership in '94 after the collapse of the Italian party system in the so-called Tangentopoli scandals, which had to do with bribes paid to the leaders of big slush funds that the leaders of three of the big I think it's three of the parties were handing out. A lot of the top party leaders went to jail, and the result was a total wipeout of the Italian party system. And here was Berlusconi, and he was really entertaining, and he seemed to be blunt, and he was the guy. And
he dominated for like a decade or so.
oh, at least, I mean, and he was back, until, let's say, after the finance crisis. It was a few years after the finance crisis that his departure was sort of engineered by the European Union and the opposition in Italy. But Italy is in a, I'm afraid, in a very precarious position. As you say, the jokes about Italian misgovernment, I think, were always very superficial. Right. Italy is a very sophisticated country, and a very, they have some elements of what we would see as genuine corruption. For instance, they tend to change their electoral laws after every election.
Right.
But all Western countries have got a few things like that. Right. I think in general, you'd say that, whether Italy was being run by Berlusconi or by people on the center left in the last 25 years, I think they've run a remarkably tight ship. Italy came into the 90s with a great deal of debt. They piled up a lot of debt during the Cold War, so they were in a very bad fiscal position in 1994 even. I think they have the second largest debt in the world besides ours. They've got right now they've got 2.3 trillion euros in debt, and if you don't have a reserve currency, in fact, if you don't have a currency at all, given the way the euro is arranged, that's a problem. But I think that in the time since Berlusconi came to power, both parties have run a very tight ship.
But nonetheless, there's this huge rebellion and unhappiness.
And
so, what's that about? I mean, is it Italy specific? Is it part of the broader phenomenon we see throughout Europe and I suppose in the U.S.? Where does it go?
I think that all countries are sort of the global economy, if we may use shorthand for something that would take an hour to sort of really unpack, is really disrupting all institutions, all of the institutions that people really cared about, whether they're, banks, local government, marriage, public utilities, sort of mores, everything. It's all going up in the air. And Italy is, I think, a country where those institutions are they're thicker than they are everywhere else. The Italians have a sense that they're really the inheritors of these institutions that are hundreds and hundreds of years old in a way that we really don't. So there's something very, I think, take it as an insult that these things are
disruptive.
Disruptive. Yeah.
So that's global. Let's call it globalization, if you want to use that term, and automation, I suppose, and everything that goes with that.
Yeah.
What about immigration? How important do you think that is?
I think it's hugely important, and I think that it's very important everywhere. On the one hand, it's a symbol of the disruption. I mean, now you have to deal with unfamiliar people, and independent of whether one is a tolerant or an intolerant person, it's an uncomfortable thing to deal with people whose ways you're not used to. But I think in Italy, the thing that's really different about immigration in Italy is the way it's interacting with their imploding population and their debt. And I've told you, they have the 2.3 trillion euros in debt. Their population is shrinking, and
in absolute numbers.
Yes, it's going down, and Italy has had a low birth rate for a long time, and statisticians have always said, well, in another 10 years, Italy's birth rate will start to shrink. And but the statistics that came out earlier this year from ISTAT were really alarming. They were not unexpected, but it kind of shows that Italy is beginning to go into the steep downhill part of the parabola when it comes to their population. And there are a lot of people who will say, well, that's okay, it can be replaced with immigration. But, so you've got fewer workers in Italy who can cover now this $2.3 trillion debt. At some point, fewer people to operate the economy means a smaller economy. And I think that Italy is at the very limit of what kind of it's at the very limit of the its productive ability to pay off this debt. There are some who might say, immigrants will be able to replace the workers that we're losing from population loss. But they're not educated in the Italian system. They are really unlikely to add value in the way that an Italian worker does for a generation or more.
What and how much of all this is Italy specific, and how much are we looking at something that's a more extreme version of what's happening elsewhere? I mean, one could say, okay, well, Italy's always a mess. Their population decline is more dramatic. The southern Mediterranean countries have a tough time than the northern countries, but, Germany, France, those remain. I mean, how much are we looking at a European crisis, and how much are we looking at some individual problems in different countries?
Yeah, I think it's a global crisis. I think that it's tempting for us to look at it as a Western thing because it does seem to involve the West first. But I think you can see it in all countries. All countries find their institutions under threat. In Latin America, I think in the Pacific. I mean,
Russia in its own way, I
Russia.
suppose.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, Eastern Europe is a great example. I mean, but even if you look in, you might call it the Southwest Pacific or Southeast Asia, there's a certain populist style emerging there in the Philippines, in Thailand,
That's a good point.
In Indonesia. So
you think if you really step back, I'd actually thought we were talking more about these specific countries in Europe, but I'm interested in this. You really are seeing, the kind of populist waves and their different incarnations depending on different circumstances, I suppose. The big thing is the global economy, the disruption of globalization. Is that's what you think is affecting everywhere? I guess economic and cultural globalization in the sense.
Yeah, well,
I
think
these sort of established ways are under assault.
Yeah, there's an economic and but there's a globalization is kind of an economic phenomenon, but there's a way to promote it there's a way to promote it politically. And I think that, so in Europe, it's the European Union that's the great expression of the promotion of globalization. And so in the recent Hungarian elections, you can see that there's a wish for more, for the people to have more of a purchase on their country's government. That's what Orban was doing.
Keep sort of the kind of nationalism and populism and xenophobia, maybe, and all that, nativism, whatever you want to call it, is an expression of that desire.
Yeah, I mean, Orban is, Orban's given a couple of speeches over the last decade that have really laid out better than anyone else in a systematic way what it is the populists want. And he spoke of, he gave a 2014 speech, I think, in which he spoke of illiberal democracy. It's a very often misunderstood speech. I mean, he did call for illiberal democracy, as it is said that he did. But he did it having already diagnosed the democracy that we have today as being illiberal. And I think that what he meant by that was that the European Union's instances had become kind of undemocratic. That Hungary was being asked to do things that its people hadn't agreed to. And I think that when he said illiberal, he meant the government cannot just be neutral. The government has to have a set of values. And that's a very interesting psychological and spiritual question about whether, a state needs to be directed towards something, in order to function well. But he believes it does, and he wants it to be a more patriotic, Hungarian first type state. And the second speech he gave was in the following summer at a youth retreat for his Fidesz party, in which he said very bluntly that Hungary is going to get to choose who gets to be a Hungarian. And one of the things that it can do is sort of say, this is our culture. We have an open heart, but we don't have a limitless ability to take in newcomers. And then he said some very curious and kind of original things about the Western regime of multiculturalism. He said, Hungary chooses not to be a multicultural country. And he said, you look at France and Germany, and he said throughout, we are not criticizing these countries for what they've done. They're sovereign states. They have the right to make their choices. But we choose not to repeat that experiment, he said.
Is that doable? I mean, so I think one conventional, which I'm slightly sympathetic to, I've got to say, critique of this is leaving aside whether it's desirable or not to have that kind of regime, whether how illiberal it would be and how much it would curb certain things we think are desirable in politics. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, more tolerant outlook, you might say. Is it also just doable? I mean, is globalism, could one practically speaking stand, have a successful Hungary first policy given the nature of the modern economy and modern communications and all the cliched ways we think, but mostly true, I suppose, ways we think about the modern world, I mean, is it not just a backward-looking expression of dismay, sort of?
I think it sort of depends on where you are in the international production cycle, maybe. I mean, I think certain of the countries that are in what we think of as the third world have not, I mean, they sort of, or we used to think of as the third world, they are not wrapped into they're not changing as quickly maybe as some of the, well, I'd take that back. They are changing through emigration. It's just the change that happens there is an absence, right? I would say there are examples of countries that, in relative terms, have done without immigration. I'd say Denmark, in the last 15 years, or let's say in the last 17 years. I think their big legal reforms were in 2001. Denmark and Sweden have been on very different trajectories in terms of their involvement in global immigration flows. And Denmark does not seem to have done worse than Sweden. Mm-hmm. But I think that actually, that's only a small part of the question. Europeans talk about the four freedoms, I think, and they're like freedom of movement of people, services, capital, and goods. Perhaps people is the least important of those in terms of the global economy. I think everyone's going to be affected by the global economy one way or another.
So how do these populist movements play out? I mean, do they end in sort of unhappy lashing out at foreigners, but not really succeeding in creating any kind of?
It's very hard to tell. I mean, they have. I can't predict the future.
But you think they're real? They're real and they're serious. They're not like going away in a year or two. Or
no, I don't think so.
They're not just the after effects of the 2008 financial crisis or
I think they're real,
bad decision by Merkel and dealing with the immigrants in 2015 or whatever. You think that's
I think that there's real. There are some real pressures there that are going to endure. I think that that with global competition, people in these once more closed economies are losing ground, there are great demographic pressures that will keep the sort of movement of people towards Europe, like we saw from Syria and other places in 2015, that will keep that from being a one-shot deal. There are still poor people in these parts of the world. There are still people dislocated by war. That's just in the Middle East. Africa is growing at an extraordinary rate. Africa is growing more quickly than any part of the earth ever has in history, and there are still not a lot of jobs there. So there are these pressures on Europe that Europe will feel a need to defend itself against. So I think that this configuration of forces is going to last quite a while.
And what does that imply for the European Union?
I think the European Union is less credible in its offer of carrots and sticks now than it was, say, 10 years ago. I mean, at the present moment, it's trying to discipline Poland for what it sees as various trespasses against European values. I see you looking at your watch there, like George H.W. Bush there.
Right, yeah. We can have a half-hour conversation about Poland.
I think the European Union right now is trying to discipline Poland for various trespasses against what it sees as democracy, like stacking the Supreme Court or altering the rules by which Supreme Court justices are appointed. I would say this is not really. It's not really a democracy that the new populist or that the law and justice government is working against. It's the old style balanced republic that Poland had before, and that was compatible with the European Union's vision of Poland.
The European Union, I mean, that whole project, which for all that people and we were one of them, I think, each of us in different ways, critical of it, but it seemed to just be able to chug along, and suppress different little outbursts against it and deal with problems. The elites were powerful. Is that near the end of the road?
Yes, it is, because I think it was tied into a certain economic system that seemed to have a great deal of power. I think that since the financial crisis, I think we see that a lot of that economic power was illusory, and that Europe has actually been losing ground to other parts of the world since then. So I think that people have less of a sense that they're evolved, that they're riding the crest of a wave of progress. I think that Europeans who go to China don't exactly feel that they're at the cutting edge of the world economy.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if the EU can't promise that much material progress, and it doesn't do much for you spiritually or culturally, et cetera, then so what's the point? I mean,
that's right.
It keeps, well, I guess the point one would say, the EU people would say, is it keeps all these terrible, potentially violent, intolerant, and unpleasant nationalist sentiments under control, and it prevents the Europe of the 20s and 30s. And that would be
but increasingly the people it's keeping under control that way are like majorities in some of these countries. So it winds up sort of like insulting the people that are supposed to make it up. So the thing that it's doing in Poland now, where you have a conservative party called the Law and Justice Party, that's a party that came to power during the migration crisis when Angela Merkel, having invited 1.5 million migrants in from Syria and the Middle East, attempted to share them and spread them throughout Europe. And she won that vote by a hair with the vote of Poland. And then the Polish government fell. And so now the countries of the so-called Visegrad countries of East Central Europe, Slovakia, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, they don't want any migrants at all. The number of migrants they want is zero.
And they're strong enough to keep them out. I mean, the EU can't just force them.
Domestically, they're strong enough to keep them out. Okay, I mean they've got a solid. If you look at the opinion polls in these countries, the Czechs are a little more tolerant of immigration. They're about 20% of the people who would be happy to admit a few immigrants. In the other countries, it's in the 90s to single digits. Wow. I mean, they don't want immigration, and it's against this backdrop that the European Union is trying to open, I think, what is called an Article 7 motion against Poland, which would ultimately deprive them of their voting rights in the European Union governing structures. Right. Well, that's a really kind of weird kind of weapon to use. It's never been used, and you can see why it wouldn't be used. I mean, right. Who wants to stay in an organization that you don't have voting rights in? It's not a very logical type of disciplinary thing. So I think there's a general feeling that that's a sort of really toothless weapon. Let's just say they have less recourse to punish Poland than they did Greece, say 5-6 years ago, 10 years ago over the euro.
And is the euro itself enough to hold people in and kind of leverage against these more nationalist movements? Or at the end of the day, what happens? They could have nationalism with the euro, or does the euro fall apart?
On the one hand, not everyone is in the euro, so right. It's not holding everyone in. On the other hand, it's been very effective in keeping people in. I think Greece, it was the euro that kept Greece in. I think that I think most people believe that Greece would be better off without the euro. I think that they're in the euro at too high a real exchange rate, and right. they're losing all their industry. But there would be a period of extraordinary disruption, and I don't think that the left-wing Syriza government there, which was making noises about pulling out of the euro, I think that they were too scared of what would happen.
But I guess you could have pretty fierce nationalism. Let's just leave aside the value judgment on it, but Hungary, Poland, sort of, but a little more even. With a euro, I mean, it'd just be like the fact that you have a common currency doesn't mean people would have to live with that or have its own economic implications, I suppose. But it doesn't stop you from having border controls and government takeovers of industry and
It should stop you from having government takeovers of industry.
Well, I guess it would, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the rules of the European Union generally do that, and
so I guess that's the question. I mean, how much you sort of the internationalizing, the globalizing force of the euro, how much that cuts against or limits or checks the...
Right. So you have people sort of now sort of disobeying the European Union without the European Union's really having an effective response to it.
But the logical implication of this surely is for the euro at some point to fall apart,
at some
even
point.
though it's disruptive.
Yeah.
And I guess Brexit in this context, I'm just now really stepping back, and I'm, as I say, I follow this much less than I should. So you had the 2015 Merkel announcement and decision, which was historians will say was a big moment, I suppose. And then 2016 is Brexit, which is related, of course.
Yes, I think it is.
And also surely a big moment, because even though the UK has always been a much more questionable participant in the European project, to actually get out and tell me where now you think, and they seem to be getting out, right? I mean, for all the doubts and difficulties, won't that be kind of a big deal when a country shows it can, if it does, that it can leave and still be a functioning modern economy? And
yes, I mean, already, in a way, the anti-Brexit case was oversold. If you remember David Cameron, who was then the prime minister, he brought almost every European head of state. He brought Barack Obama there to tell the British people that there would be an economic collapse. There would be, I think they were talking about famine. Obama said that if Britain left the European Union, it would have to get to the back of the queue. Yeah. That was the word he used, queue, not line, when it came to trade deals and diplomacy. And that didn't happen. So I think that that already damaged the credibility of people warning other countries against an exit. On the other hand, Britain, there is not, I mean, as we were discussing earlier, there's no going back to the old sort of like pre-global economy type of sovereignty. If you want to trade, and all of these countries are more and more specialized, if you want to maintain your standard of living, you're going to have to trade. And if you want to trade, you're going to have to submit to a certain amount of regulatory convergence. So to that extent, the people who said, Britain is still going to have to obey these EU rules, but they're not going to have a vote in the EU now, that's sort of right. But I think that the people who made that point really, they underestimated how important it is for people to have the final say. They're happy to sort of like make deals with other people. They just don't want to be subject to other people's. And I think that that's what Brexit really was about. And it's, I think it's sort of striking that they've actually been able to take it this far. I mean, there's a sort of a provisional agreement now for the exit in 2019. I don't know how well that will hold up or what the pitfalls along the way will be, but it's quite an achievement. I mean, the post-Brexit negotiations.
And they may take some hit to their standard of living and so forth, but it's not been hugely dramatic, right? So you can't, it doesn't.
Well, it hasn't been so far. Who knows? I mean,
they don't seem to regret the decision, the British public.
Well, the people who were against it are still against it. So I mean, it was a narrow majority. It was a 52 to 48 majority, and it's always going to float around 50-50, I think.
But it is striking. I mean, that will be a moment when they actually, if they navigate this very difficult passage of departure moderately successfully, I do think, given what expectations on the Remain side, given what the rhetoric on the Remain side was, and I've got to think it gives a shot in the arm to other people elsewhere in Europe who say, maybe we can't leave, but we can renegotiate, we can change. And it probably is true that the European project, more than most, sort of depended on a certain kind of, well, we just have no choice, we've just got to go along, this is the train of history.
That's right.
We've got to hop aboard. And once you sort of lose that faith in or submission to the future, things get up in the air, right? I mean,
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, that will be interesting. If so, you think they will get out in 29? I mean,
yes,
it looks like they really will be.
I think so. I think it's getting late to
to reverse
sort of
that.
like, yes.
There were moments where it looked like they might not make it, so to speak, or that but
Well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of, I think that most of the people who, let's say, run Britain, most of the important journalists and, most of the important, businessmen, they tend to like the European Union.
Yeah.
They like the predictability of the rules it gives, so they don't want it. And so it's always very easy to get the impression that the Brexit case is weaker than it actually is.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess it can be true both that it's not going to fulfill the dreams of some of the exit leave people. They will have Churchill's Britain back or something like that, or the glories of the empire, or British pride and all that stuff. I mean, it might be you could have a collapse of Europe without fulfilling the dreams of some of the traditional critics of the EU who were Gaullists or Churchillians. I mean, Churchill's complicated, but who wanted kind of greatness for these countries. You could have not greatness and not the EU.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. I mean, I don't think any of these things are ever predictable. I don't think that. Who knows what life holds for any of us? I mean, I don't think that the Churchillian tone in the Brexit discussions was the predominant one. I think that there were really two. There was the UKIP version of Brexit, which was, we're getting swamped by immigrants and you won't recognize Britain in 5 or 10 years. And then there was the Tory capitalist one, which is Britain can be unleashed from EU regulation and become a dynamo of entrepreneurship.
Financial hub.
And I don't think that Britain is already that, really. I don't think that was really a very convincing argument.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Germany, so that's the heart of it, the center of the European project, the center of Europe. Biggest, most powerful, richest country, right?
Yeah.
So what's happening there?
Germany, I think that, in Germany, you have the same collapse of the center-left parties that's happening everywhere in the world, arguably in our country as well. And it's hard to really describe this in general terms, but basically a working man's party turned into a coalition of working people and minorities and university types. And then it's sort of like in doing so, these went from parties that were based on equality, as I think someone has said, to parties that are based on diversity. And I think that they became sort of centered in the university in a couple of ways, but in terms of multicultural doctrines and
identity politics,
right? And because they were centered in the universities, they came to dominate the commanding heights of the economy, the internet. Basically, we have an information economy, and they were the people who were where the information was, and so that transformation's happening everywhere. It's happening it's happened much more slowly in Germany than it has anywhere else, and at the end of it, it's hard to say who the Social Democrats coalition is. Okay, so they had an extraordinary implosion in their vote. They went from, I think, over 30% of the vote to under 20% of the vote. So they're really struggling. Now, before the election last fall, the Social Democrats were in coalition with the Christian Democrats, Merkel's Christian Democrats. This is a very interesting type of government that Germany has, a grand coalition, where you have the two parties joined together. And it's sort of like if we had like a Democratic Republican coalition in the United States.
Hillary Clinton government.
That's right. That's right. And so if one of them was the president and the other was the vice president, and there's something a little bit unsavory about it, right? So So Germans had
establishment getting together to take care of each other.
That's right. And so Germany had one of these governments in the late 1960s, but other than that, it's been kind of anathema. But now, since Merkel came to power, they've had 3 of them. I mean, if we count the incoming one. And that makes people sort of distrust them more. And in this last election, the Social Democrats realized that by being hooked to Merkel without having any power, by being the junior party in a coalition, they were sort of on a suicide mission. That no one wants them to sort of just be sort of like providing the ballast for the other party's agenda, even though it's more complicated than that, because Merkel has actually been behaving like a social democrat. But so the country was sick to death of, like the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. They gave them both much lower scores. And at the end of the day, they were still the only workable government. So basically they punished this grand coalition, and they got a grand coalition back. But now the Social Democrats are sort of strengthened by their weakness. They say to Merkel, we can't enter your government without destroying ourselves. So what are you going to give us for this? This is, again, a suicide mission that we're on. So she's given them now, they've got like 6 important posts in the cabinet. And it's almost like a social democratic government. And so that is bound to, I'm afraid, stoke the very same sentiments that led to such poor results for the 2 establishment parties, and which means that this is kind of like developing momentum.
And so they have a sort of stable coalition government for now, but a shrunken one, and somehow one that...
I'd agree about shrunken. I'm not sure I'd agree about stable.
It's sort of a diminishing returns kind of situation. They just hanging on kind of. And that's at the heart of Europe. And then in France, we had, Macron won, so he's a centrist, and that cheered up the people who hoped the center might hold. Yep. Of course, he won in a slightly weird way, right? He almost didn't win, for one thing. The left and right got a lot of votes.
So France has an unusual presidential system, a presidential election system, which is designed to sort of like give the appearance of overwhelming national, majorities. But basically in the first round, you had an almost even split between 4 candidates. There was Macron. Well, let's explain first what happened in France. You had the same implosion of a social democratic party. And François Hollande, who was the president, elected with a decent majority in 2012, rapidly fell to the point where he had the lowest popularity scores ever recorded by any European politician since the Second World War. He was down into single digits. And it became apparent, or at least it became apparent to his finance minister, the very astute, Macron, that the Socialist Party in France would not be a vehicle to elect anyone to the presidency. And so he started his own party. There was a little rump Socialist Party which got into single digits of the votes. It looks to be dead. So Macron has basically taken elements of the Socialist Party, elements of the establishment center-right parties, and a bunch of sort of anti-establishment kind of good government types found on the internet in a kind of the way that the Italian 5-star movement has, and put them together into a movement. And it's very hard to say what kind of movement it's going to be, because he personally only got 23% of the vote in the first round of the French election. So it would seem he's dependent on these other people. On the other hand, the fact that so many of these newcomers to La République en Marche, which is what his party is called, the fact that so many of these newcomers really have no experience in politics before, might give him the ability to consolidate them all into a highly obedient, personalized kind of party. Well, the jury is still out on it.
But you don't think, contrary to what many people here would hope, it doesn't sound like you think Macron reflects a great resurgence of the center. The center can hold. This fresh new center can govern Europe.
No, I think I think that he's not now, at least. And I mean, I think he's casting about for ways to matter. I think he's been very smart about the way he's dealt with the United States, for instance. I mean, sometimes he tweaks Trump for the benefit of the French public, and they like it. But he has also kept himself at the middle of the Western alliance. So he's a guy who's got a great political instinct, and he could maybe survive for a long time, and just by being there, sort of actually become something new. But right now, his position doesn't strike me as very strong.
Interesting. So what happens? I mean, are there more obvious, I mean, of course, life is full of surprises, but are there obvious inflection points where one would say, I guess Britain getting out is one thing that will happen. I suppose if there were a recession, that would strain certain parts of the continent quite a lot, right? I mean, I'm just curious, are there particular things you're looking for as you, over the next months or a couple of years, either chronological things or developments that could happen? I mean, what would you? Yeah. Is immigration, is that sort of calmed down, or is that just a ticking time bomb that's about to go off again? Or
I think it can't calm down, because there's so much. Because Europe is not the only participant in this. I mean, Europe can't just shut it off. I mean, Africa continues to grow. I mean, it's going to add. I want to stress the population growth. Africa is going to add. It's going to add by 2050, from here to 2050, more people than there are in Europe.
Is that right?
That's going to be the growth. That's not going to be the size of the continent. That's going to be the growth in the size of the continent. And unless some and the fact that you have a lot more mouths to feed suddenly means that that's not generally amenable to capital formation and increased productivity and that kind of thing. So it means that along with that, there's going to be economic trouble. So there's pressure from there. The flow from the Middle East has been held off really only by Europe's agreement with Erdogan, where they kind of look the other way, and he holds off the immigrant pressure. But that's totally dependent on Erdogan's state of mind, and we don't really know about that. So they don't have all the cards in their hand on that. Anything could happen. When you talk about so immigration could be a total wild card. Very unpredictable things could happen. But when you talk about inflection points, I just feel that Europe is going to find its debt increasingly hard to handle, and I think that it's going to be hard to hold. It's going to be hard to hold the euro together. I'm not a banker or anything, but I have a hard time seeing how, when you have a shrinking productive population, a stagnant productivity levels, and growing debt, how that all holds together over the long term.
And Germany can't keep sort of bailing everyone out, which is in fact what they've been doing, right?
Well, that's more complicated. I think it's been very beneficial. The euro has been very beneficial
bailing
to Germany
for a system that's very good for them with exports.
Right.
So, right. But the public there doesn't like.
Right. That's right. So there's a limit to how much Germany. I mean, the other countries in Europe all seem to be waiting for a consolidation of the European budget that would allow them to sort of tap Germany's credit explicitly, but that's not going to happen. Unless Merkel were to find a way to just impose that on Germany. And this is the thing where it's an interesting thing about Merkel's personality. Everyone has this stereotype of her as kind of like dour and staid and small c conservative, but she's actually kind of a reckless person. She loves, reckless might not be the word, let's say she loves grand gestures, you know. I mean, you can say that after the Fukushima tidal wave, tsunami and tidal wave in Japan, she announced that Germany would get out of nuclear energy. That's a huge, huge thing. The invitation to the Syrians in 2015. And so now you can ask, maybe she will want to go down in history as the person who really bound Germany back into the family of nations by sharing its, you know, fiscal situation with them.
That would be something.
Yeah.
Anything else we should be looking for over the next months and year? This has been fascinating. I mean, I guess I'm now really not perturbed, but just struck by the. So I mean, you go to Europe and the surface stability holds. You know, that's what's so striking, right? I mean,
I think it depends on where you go.
Maybe not.
Now,
I haven't traveled nearly as much.
No, but I mean, you know, I think that Paris, if you go to the major cities and that, you know, in Paris and certain others, they look great. But I was in Cherbourg last fall, and that's a you know, and you know, an old town in Normandy. It used to be a port, a center of manufacturing and shipping, and now it's just really hollowed out. You know, you walk through the old business districts and you see one sort of like empty plate glass window after another. Just store after store after store is closed. You know, in part it's due to a change in the style of retail. I mean, there's both American shopping malls and, you know, online shopping, but the logic of hubs like this is not any longer really apparent to France. So I think you're beginning to see on the surface what is actually happening underneath at the level of investment.
And I guess an expensive welfare state and declining population.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big deal. We at least,
that's right.
And we're not great shape. We certainly have a debt that's unsustainable, I would say.
Right.
But you do have, with population growth, you can still have more laborers, or at least many fewer laborers.
Gives you a little wiggle room.
Yeah, a little more chance to sustain that and work your way out of it.
To last until the next boom,
Yeah, but Italy is not the only place in Europe that's declining now in population. Is that right?
That's right. Germany. And the average age in these people, and you remember that the population that we're talking about has a relatively low number of workers. And of the, you know, and the labor force participation is falling too. So you have, you know, the average age of Germany is close to 50 now. I mean, it's 47 or 48. I mean,
wow.
So.
And the young people coming in are Syrian immigrants who are going to have
many
tough
are.
time.
Many are. I mean, I think it's about for that generation. That's the people who came are mostly in their 20s. It'll be about, I don't know, a sixth of that generation.
Wow. And they may assimilate and do great, or they may not, right?
That's right.
That's a very big question. Yeah, that's interesting. Any other? But how much of this is Europe, and how much of this is just the future in general? I'll close with that question.
Oh.
Certainly, a lot of it resonates with the U.S. As you said, it's not as if there are parts of Latin America where you could make a similar argument. Japan's shrinking, I believe, now, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Population.
Well, you know, Japan would be along with Denmark a sort of an alternative to this, because Japan is also semi-closed to the to this, and Japan has figured that actually if you are shrinking, as long as you keep up productivity, shrinking can give you a better standard of living. I mean, so the funny thing that struck me about Japan, and I beg your pardon for like telling you an anecdote. I mean, I sort of, you know, I get the impression, you know, Japan has had the same espresso coffee type craze that we've had over the last quarter century here, and yet there aren't so many coffee shops. What you have in Japan is machines. And they have these giant machines all over the country where you can get any kind of hot coffee you like. You can get like a sweet, you know, double espresso macchiato. You can, you get a extra strong espresso. You can get an iced this. You can get it hot or cold. You can get them out of machine on almost any street corner, it seems. So what's happening is they are doing with machinery and computers what we are still doing with, you know, with human labor. That's the way they are sort of compensating for their lack of manpower in a global economy that seems to require a lot of low-end labor.
Maybe greater political stability, I guess. I mean, if they can.
Yes, probably. Probably. They have, I mean, certainly internally. I mean, that's a strength of theirs, I think.
Though one never knows also there what kind of sentiments are beneath the surface and how much they look at China and decide at some point, you know, this is unacceptable. We need to have nuclear weapons, right? I mean, I think you can.
Well, I think that certainly is. I think that's being openly discussed. I think.
Yeah.
Even here among among Japan experts. Yeah.
So you do wonder in general how much the sort of global the stability is not just an economic question or a European question, but a sort of, I guess the global economy, it really does, the disruption manifests itself in many, many ways, right?
Yes. Yes.
Any last words of
no,
hope or despair?
No.
Nothing. No, you're the. I mean, you're more sympathetic, I would say, than probably I am to some of these populist nationalist movements, if that's the term for them, as a sort of expression of democracy, really.
Yes, of democracy and sovereignty. I think that.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you? But could they work? I guess that would be the question. Are they sort of? I mean, could they actually figure out ways to accommodate a global economy and still have a serious manifestation of sovereignty? I guess the answer is we don't know, right? Or
I guess we don't know. I mean, I think that in Europe, at least, the sort of sovereignty that the people who are uneasy about immigration and declining standards of living, the sort of sovereignty they want is not really compatible with the European Union. It does require borders. France would need to have its borders back. So Italy would need to be able to expel migrants coming to their shores. I mean, put them on boats and send them back to Libya or something like that, in a way that they cannot with the European Union. And it's kind of interesting that the alternatives have not really fully presented themselves to people. I think to be a populist means to be against the European Union. And I think the camps are, the logic of this is much more polarizing than any, maybe thankfully, than anyone yet realizes. I mean, I think you have a quarter of the voters are populists who want to get out of the European Union. A quarter of the voters are anti-populists who want to stay in the European Union. And the other people in the middle are a muddle or a mix. And so the Five-Star Movement in Italy is that sort of muddle or mix. But I guess over the long term, these positions are probably going to polarize and harden.
And I suppose if there's a shock, either a foreign policy shock or an economic shock, another one. There hasn't been one for a while, though. For all the slow growth, there really hasn't been a terrible situation, right, in 8-9 years. That would be a moment where maybe decisions would be made, so to speak.
Right, that's right.
And that could happen fairly soon, I guess, right? We've had 7-8 years of
growth. When they happen,
When
they happen, you tend not to expect them. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, when that happens, we have to get back together and
have
a conversation to analyze what you very interestingly laid out here, really thought-provoking and provocative and not entirely cheering, but that's
I'm sorry.
That's the world we live in. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay.
Thank
People
you.
can deal with it.
Yeah.
Chris Caldwell, thanks so much for
Thank
joining
you,
me.
Bill.
And thank you for joining us on Conversations.